Well, Rome and Egypt had such an intense relationship. It's
They did.
almost like the elephant in the room if you don't go there at some point. Wasn't
Yes.
Egypt the breadbasket for Rome?
It was supposed to be, yes. I would not want to do a lot of Pharaoh stuff, I'm afraid. That doesn't attract me very much, but Rome and Alexandria, I think, could be where he goes.
And then there was you've done one in Ostia, which was
Yes.
at that time the Roman port, as opposed to Civitavecchia, which is
I'm
now
glad
the
you
Roman
said that.
port. Yes, I just looked at it this morning since I'm going there day after tomorrow. But Ostia, I think you've said to me, was actually a place of surprising interest to visit today still.
Yes,
you don't hear. I say
it's
surprising because you don't hear about it much.
You don't know. It's as good as Pompeii, I think, in what's left there. Some of the houses survive to the second story, which they don't in Pompeii. And very few people go there. So if you choose your moment, you can be there totally alone and look around and think you are actually back in the Roman town. The Tiber is very narrow and silty. It's not what I, living in London on the Thames, consider to be a decent river to build a major city on. And so they had to have a port at the mouth of the Tiber, and Ostia, and an extra bit attached to it, because even Ostia itself got silted up, called Portus. That was where all the ships from all over the empire came in the first instance, and everything was unloaded. And it's still a visitable site. It costs about 75p, as I would call it, on hardly any euros, on a little train you take from Rome, and it's the most wonderful place to visit.
Well, I was very pleased to hear it, and I'm looking forward to going there.
I hope you manage it. You'll like it. Trust me.
I'm sure I will. And of course, one of the great things about reading your books is that although you are writing in the Roman Empire some 2,000 years ago, a lot of it's still there.
Yes.
So it's possible to use your books in a way as kind of a tour planner because the basic shape of things. In fact, there's some very good tenements, if I remember right, someplace just as you leave the tomb of Victor Emmanuel and you're kind of going back towards
on the edge
Forum.
of the Palatine Hill. Yes,
Yeah.
they're just stuck there, open to the elements. And if you grew up with British conservation, you are horrified by how they just crumble away year after year.
But nevertheless, it's a very kind of a moment where if you've been reading Falco, you can kind of imagine how he lived, because we don't think of Rome as kind of high-rise apartment buildings of its day, but they were, weren't they?
What people tend to think about are the monumental buildings, the temples, the courts. They forget that people lived there, and they didn't all live in major villas, because within Rome itself, as in any major city today, there wasn't the land for it, really. So one of the big surprises I had when I started to research Rome, and it comes, I think, as a big surprise to many readers, is that almost all of the ordinary people and some of the not so ordinary people lived in what we would call flats or apartments, and some of them were pretty grim.
Tenements. In fact. And many of them, in fact most of them, couldn't really live on all those beautiful seven hills, but lived in sort of more, nearly swampy land.
The nasty valleys in between.
Did they actually have malaria?
They did, yes.
Because I was amazed when we went to Ephesus to discover that city had been, largely ruined by the fact that the river, again, or the port, had silted up and created these terrible swamps, and they had deforested it for ships and whatever, and then the mosquitoes and the malaria just killed off the population.
Nobody understood, of course, that mosquitoes and malaria were linked, so that didn't help, and they didn't have quinine even if they had understood it. There were marshes outside Rome which were eventually drained, the Pontine marshes, which were completely malarial. We had malaria in Britain in those days, and sadly it is coming back.
Is it?
Yes, so it's something we all have to get to grips with.
Well, going back to the Course of Honor, which I'm happy to say eventually did get published, and I'm trying to remember, how many Falcos were there before Course of Honor came out?
I can't remember exactly, but it was something like 10 years. And I finally showed it to my editor, who'd heard about it over the years, and he read it and then said, "This is wonderful, why haven't I been shown this before?" And I know he wouldn't have published it. What they did was to disguise it as a Falco, to give it a jacket that made it look as though it's all right, you don't have to worry, here's another one. what is nice for me is that many people who read it love it. Some don't like the fact that Falco's not in it, but many people have written and said it's my favourite book. So that is just confirming my faith in the Course of Honour. I always believed in it.
You had a lot of fun in one of the Falcos. I don't remember which one. There's is not the lady from Course of Honor or someone?
Yes,
she shows up.
Don't ask me which one she's in.
I can't remember either, but she does a cameo. I know
she does. Yes, she in a way helps Falco to. I think it must be when he's made. He works for the census, which was fairly early on in Vespasian's reign, and Caenis more or less gets him that job, and that's how he manages to not make his fortune, because he's never going to be too rich. That would be too boring to write about, but he makes enough to live a decent life, which I felt I had to do because I was so sorry for his girlfriend living in squalor.
But it wasn't just that. In order for him to actually marry Helena Justina, and he was the father of the children, or to be sort of accepted, didn't he have to rise in rank in order for that to happen? I thought he has to rise to the equestrian class in order.
She's a senator's daughter,
Right.
so it's frowned upon for a senator's child or a senator to marry beneath them, and it's easier if Falco is in the middle rank than if he had stayed a plebeian.
But he does strive for that. I mean, he's looking for money and other things as we go along.
He's working, as we all work. He's working to make a life for himself. He wants to have a decent home. He's basically he's a true Roman, so he's very domestic.
But you've mentioned back with is it Vespasian or Vespasian?
Vespasian, I say.
Vespasian, okay.
It's easier.
That he was not able to marry his mistress because she had been a slave.
That's a very specific thing. Senators, or people who wanted to be in the Senate, as he was when he first knew Antonia Caenis, were legally forbidden from marrying either slaves or people who had been slaves. So even when Caenis is a freedwoman, he can't marry her. And therefore, the love story is that they are lovers when they're young. He can't marry her. He wants to be in the Senate. His mother persuades him to give up Caenis and go into the Senate and have a proper career. And then he marries properly to a distant relative, I think. And when his wife dies and he's done everything he should do, he's been the victor of Britain, he has 3 children, which a Roman was supposed to do. He doesn't care any longer, so he goes back and Caenis takes him back, which I always think was very good of her, really.
Well, it was. I think it's a fascinating book, but one does have to understand it, just as that book of Edith's I mentioned, The Dilemma of the Abandoned Wife. Only everybody didn't see her as abandoned, but rather she should be excited that her husband had decided to leave her for the church. I think Caenis had a dilemma unique to her time and situation.
And the way I've done it, I had to invent most of it because very little is known about her, because she was a freed slave. Nothing is written about her worth speaking of. The way I do it is that she can see Vespasian's potential, and so she knows it's her duty almost to stand back and let him develop. And then, of course, when he is a contender to be emperor, again, she knows that he's the right man for the job after all the chaos that's gone before with Nero and others. And she also thinks that means that although they've now had a relationship and lived together, he will have to leave her behind, because no emperor had ever had a concubine. He still can't marry her as his partner. But the thing that was extraordinary about Vespasian, and this is true and it astonished the Romans, is that he did take her to the palace where she helped him in his work until she died.
It's a wonderful book. I think it's a very moving love story and a wonderful piece of history. But, you know, it also, because you wrote it and you learned all that, it has shaped the entire Falco series, because you have basically been there with the reign of Vespasian.
It was a good period for me to set the Falco series, because we have, to some extent, a dilemma for Vespasian. He disapproves of informers, which is what Falco is.